My wife and I were on our honeymoon in Shenandoah Valley National Park in Virginia in 2019. We were excited to get an early evening hike in as we just arrived in town. We were driving to a hike on Skyline Drive at around 6 p.m. in a thick mist with overcast skies. We passed a strange-looking, solitary man on the road a few hundred yards before the trailhead. I made a comment to my wife about how odd he looked. It was unkempt, vacant-looking. We hiked a mile and a half up the mountain to the end of the trail where it terminated at the AT. My wife stopped to pee and we collected ourselves before we turned to head back down towards our vehicle. Out of the mist, not making this up, came the guy we'd passed on the road earlier. He was low-key brandishing one of those combination hatchet-hammer multi-tools at his side. He wasn't just carrying it. It was somewhat raised. It gets creepier. He made a comment as we passed him about how we'd found a set of teeth the last time he was up there. We'd made an awkward acknowledgement of what he'd said and quickly started down towards our vehicle, looking back up to where we'd come to see if he'd turn to follow us. Once we were 100 feet away, we began running down the mountain. We'd stop every minute or so to listen and observe what was going on. It was terrifying. We obviously made it back to our car, but we were shook. We would read a few weeks later about how someone had been arrested in connection with a killing near that area when we were there. When I was in 7th or 8th grade thereabouts, our school did an early summer trip where they took 10 kids who signed up and 4 adult chaperones to keep them wrangled up into Frederick Sound in Alaska for 3 weeks total. The goal of the trip was kayaking to different wilderness beaches to camp and do some hiking. We left from Petersburg, Alaska, by a small seaplane who flew us in 4s out to our first destination, which was a beautiful little bay/cove and an island you could walk to at low tide, and a smaller one you couldn't access at all by foot. Behind the bay on the hillside was evergreen forests that went on for what looked like forever. From there, we'd be on our own for the next about 2.5 weeks by that point of the trip. It took about half a day to get that done, and the rest of the day to set up everyone's camps for the night. The first unusual thing we saw when we arrived there was back up in the tree line from the beach was old wooden ship parts. You could find ropes and pulleys thicker than our arms, old rotted pieces of carved planks and railings, and most interesting of all, a helm and its deck attachment. All of these things half buried in the dirt strewn across the tree line above the shore and in a dire state of decay. But no sign of any other part of the ship. To this day, I don't know if it had been wrecked on the shore a long time ago or if it had been wrecked at sea and chucked up onto the beach during storms. But it was eerily fascinating to all of us kids and brought up many wild ideas to be told at the campfire that night. After all the others went back to their tents, a girl I had been having a thing with over the school year and I stayed by the fire to talk and flirt. Perfect night and setting for it too. We listened to some humpback whales singing out in the bay, heard some wolves in between owl hoots from out in the very dark wilderness, and we had a starry night sky that looked like it was out of a dream with a big white moon letting a bright bluish light in between the thin trees on the shore. Both of us were finally getting tired around what must have been 1 or 2 a.m., and we ran out of easily found wood to chuck on the dying fire, and we headed back to our respective tents. The tents were set up in the first line of trees in a line running from the beach into the woods. The girls' 2 tents were right against the sand. The chaperone's tent was a couple yards away from that, and us boys' 2 tents were another couple yards from that. We were the furthest into the woods. The moonlight made it easy for me to find my way back to my tent, but once I entered the tent, I didn't see where my new friend Alex was sleeping, and I accidentally woke him up. Now, Alex and I had just become friends on that trip. We knew each other from some classes and in the hallways, and while we always were friendly with each other there, we definitely came from different social groups and didn't hang out before this trip. He was an athlete and a popular kid, and I was a skater and band kid, but we both loved the outdoors, so that in this particular moment, neither of us were having a go at each other over what I'm about to explain. We had no reason to prank each other, so to speak. "What the hell are you doing back so late?" he asked me. and I was grinning and said I was still at the fire with Lisa. He immediately sat up and wanted to hear more. We were quietly giggling about girls and teenage boy stuff when the woods outside went dead silent. The kind of silence that gives you a sick feeling in your chest and throat and a weight in your stomach. And the back of your neck feels hot like a survival instinct telling you that you're not alone out in the wild. We both noticed it too, and we fell silent. The only sound we could still hear besides the distant roll of waves was inside our tent. It was our other tent mate, Sam. Been there the whole time and was still snoring away like a chainsaw. Funny, right? Except we were more worried as to why things had gone silent outside. We felt uneasy about it and decided to listen for a minute. That's when we heard it. Now the side of our tent with the door was facing toward the other tents and the shore. This noise came from the opposite side, the woods side. I kid you all not. It sounded like a bunch of monks meditating and harmonizing on the word Om, but without saying the M, and continued in a prolonged drone. It moved from far out in the forest, coming towards our tent. It had started softly and far away, and rather quickly but steadily became louder, which is how we realized it was moving closer. It genuinely sounded human, but there was no pausing for breaths or shift in tones for any known reason. Suddenly, the noise was right outside the tent, and that's when we noticed even Sam had stopped snoring. He, as far as my knowledge, was still asleep, but his silence was making the noise more intense, and it circled us once, no wavering or swaying of the noise. It just circled, seemingly suspended in the air just feet away outside of our tent at what I can only describe as a human-ish height off the ground. We couldn't see through the tent, but the moon was still bright enough that we could see silhouettes of the trees outside, so I would assume if something was solid was making it, that it too would cast a shadow from certain angles. Nope, no visible form to this noise. No footsteps or twigs snapping, just the noise circling. At this point, Alex and I's hearts were pounding in our throats, and we had looks of terror on our faces. We just kept silent and still and listened. After it made its circle around our tent, we heard it move on over to the other boy's tent and do the same. Then down to the chaperone's tent. It circled theirs but sounded more faint due to the distance. Then it continued on to the girls' tents, where we could just barely hear it over the sound of the ocean. But sure enough, it sounded like it stayed there a minute, based on current context, most likely circling. Then after a few minutes, we heard it slowly return, now in a straight line from the beach and past us again back into the forest where it faded and disappeared. A couple of minutes after the sound stopped, the nighttime forest noises returned, and even Sam started snoring again. Alex and I quietly said to each other, "Holy crap, did you hear that too?" And then we tried to go back to sleep, but I'm sure neither of us were very successful. The next morning we went outside and checked all around the campsite and couldn't find any sort of tracks or anything different from the previous night. Nothing. We asked if anyone else in the group had been awake and heard anything weird, and the response was all no's. We didn't go further into it with any of the others, but Alex and I know that we experienced whatever that was together. After the trip was over, he and I went back to not really hanging out, but definitely when we'd see each other, we'd exchange looks of solidarity that what happened did really happen. And we both looked at each other differently now because of it. I used to work on the north slope of Alaska in the oil industry. The work we were doing required us to travel far out into the Alaska Petroleum Reserve, which is basically just untamed tundra wilderness for hundreds of miles. The oil companies would build these long ice roads in the winter that would lead to exploration drilling pads. Our job was to go out after they finished the initial drilling and test rock formations for their oil-producing qualities. It was mid-January. The sun hadn't quite come up yet. And when I say the sun hadn't come up yet, I mean in almost a month and a half. Polar nights are intense. The particular well site we were traveling to was about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, deep in the wilderness. Our job took a week, but we finished and we're heading back to camp to finish our hitch and go home. At the beginning and end of the ice roads are guard shacks that you have to check in and out of for safety, There's no cell reception and radios work only up to a distance. If you don't check in or out in a set time, they come looking for you to ensure you're not a popsicle. It was about 4 a.m, not that it mattered in the land of endless night, and we were halfway across the ice road. Travel was slow as the speed limit on the roads is only 25 miles per hour, when something appeared on the road in our headlights. It was a man, in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie jacket, walking down an ice road in wilderness tundra at 4 a.m. and it was minus 20 degrees outside. It's not unusual for the local Inuit people to be out this far hunting. Maybe his snowmobile broke down and he's trying to get back to the guard shack? Seems plausible. He didn't acknowledge us as our trucks rolled up next to him. He just kept shuffling forward. He didn't seem cold. His clothing, while totally not appropriate for this extreme weather, appeared warm and dry. We also noticed he wasn't Inuit, but Caucasian. I rolled down my window and asked if he needed any help and if he was okay. He still didn't acknowledge us and kept shuffling forward. His face was completely blank, devoid of any thought or emotions. The other guys in my truck suggested that maybe he was in an accident and in shock. I continued rolling my truck alongside him as he trudged down the road, still trying to get his attention. Even in this extreme cold, I could occasionally get whiffs of a peculiar smell coming off of him. He smelled acidic, if that makes sense. There was just a lot about this guy that made the hair on my neck stand up. The guy behind me in the truck's crew cab had had enough of all this. He rolled down his window and reached out to grab the guy. He later said he was just going to try and shake him out of his stupor. Before my buddy's hand could reach him, though, his walking popsicle spun around and latched onto my buddy's outstretched arm. He glared at my buddy and then at me with this look of pure rage, not removing his hand from his arm. If emotions had a physical temperature, this guy could have melted the entire tundra that night. My buddy groaned in pain as he tried to get his arm free from Mr. Popsicle. At that moment, this guy starts screaming in our faces. There was so much hate and rage and anger in that scream. It was absolutely terrifying. I slammed on the gas and spun out in the ice for a second before the wheels caught and launched us forward. Popsicle Dude still had a hold of my buddy's arm and was trying to pull him out of the truck. He was running alongside of the truck while the other guys in the cab held onto my buddy to keep him inside. After several moments, could have only been a few seconds at most, my buddy tore free from this guy and we hauled ass to the guard shack another 30 miles down the road. We checked in with the guards and reported what we had just seen. The guard was looking at us like we were pulling a prank, but policy said they had to check it out regardless. My buddy's arm was sore, and when he pulled back his sleeve, there were noticeable bruises in the shape of a hand around his arm. We filed a report with the guard and were told to head back to our camp. None of us really wanted to talk about what happened, and it was quite the drive the rest of the way. We flew home the next day. The next time we saw the guard at this shack, we asked him if they ever saw Mr. Popsicle on his patrols. He told us they searched up and down that ice road for a solid 12-hour shift and saw nothing, not even tracks in the snow leading off the road. He told us it was a good prank and that he'd get us back for making him waste a shift driving around. But it wasn't a prank. Who would make up a story like that? And who would willingly bruise their arm for a dumb prank? We never got a satisfying answer to what happened that evening. I still wonder about that dude. If he even was a dude. The Alaskan tundra is a weird place, and that was just one of my many weird stories from my time up there.